Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to Tournament War Room, where I am going to be going over my analysis leading into the top 32 in the Swiss rounds and kind of go over what I got right, what I got wrong, why I got it right, why I got it wrong, and why you should trust me as an analyst, because it's kind of fun to do this, go back and check my work and not just spout things into the void of the internet. I'll let you take my word for it and then leave it at that. Swiss, I was pretty spot on. I mentioned this in Tournament Tactician. Swiss was a bit of a gimme. We knew Scion was going to be the most popular deck. We knew that Ziggs Poppy was going to be like the second most popular deck. And then I said Lee Sin or Nami would be third. And they're right on each other, neck and neck. And everything kind of played out as I expected it to for the Swiss portion. Now, when we get into the top 32, you expected players to move on to counter lineups, but I didn't think it was going to happen en masse like it did. One thing that I talked about a lot was players doubling up on Lee Sin and Nami in the same lineup. Only two players did it going into the top 32, and I really thought that we were going to see more players swap over to this. Instead, everybody fell off of it. There were no Lee Sin Nami lineups in the top 32 of the America Seasonal, despite Southeast Asia actually winning with Lee Sin, Zoe, and Fizz Nami. So, like, the lineup had proven success earlier in the day in a different region, and we still just dropped off of it. Nobody made the adaptation into it. There were zero Tahm Kench Nami in the top 32 because Sixten, who brought the Tahm Kench Nami into the top 32, ended up just swapping over to Star Spring and just dropping the Nami and just putting Soraka in its place, playing the more traditional Tahm Kench deck, which worked out great. They made it to a top 4 finish. Instead, it seems like we got a lot of players looking to either soft counter the Scion or the Nami, and that caused a drop-off in both decks, as well as Lee Sin. And I think one thing that happened was we saw this massive uptick in Sivir Akshan, which I never would have imagined, as well as Yordles in Arms and Elusive Rally, and just a big upswing in Demacia. It was something that I just didn't expect. And I've mentioned before that rally decks are a little bit of a blind spot for me. It's hard for me to predict that. But even if it wasn't, I don't think I would have predicted massive upticks in the archetypes like this, specifically given like how unpopular Sivir Akshan was. There was like almost no Zed decks coming into the top 32. There was like a few Lulu Poppies, but there wasn't any like Lulu Zeds. There wasn't a whole lot of like Poppy Yordles in Arms going on. So those things really took me by surprise. And I think the reason that players moved on to something like this is they had decided to just ban the Draven Scion every time they ran into it and say, hey, I have pretty good matchups into both Lee Sin and Nami. So if players do come in on this Lee Sin Nami lineup, like we've seen have success in Southeast Asia, then I am going to absolutely body them. I have winning matchups into Lee Sin and Nami, and most players are probably going to be running at least one of these decks. And even if they're not, then I still have, a powerful solitaire game plan where I just put a bunch of units on board and I rally and I do that until you die. And that's pretty effective against a fair number of decks. And I think we saw a lot of players move over to something like that as their aggressive mid-range style, and that's why we also saw a fall off of Bandle Pirates. One other thing that I didn't expect was the big uptick in Bandletree, but again, players were looking to soft counter Scion or Nami. There was only 5 Bandletree going into the top 32, and then here we swap over to players even bringing 3 Bandletree or 2 Bandletree. In fact, the one Freljord deck in top 32 was actually just the 3rd Bandletree deck in a player's lineup, and rather than getting a Lee Sin Nami lineup in order to counter the Scion, instead we just saw a lot of players go for one of these and then Bandletree and Darkness. Again, we saw an uptick in Darkness, which is not something that I expected. I felt like anybody who felt like they were a good Darkness player was going to play it in Swiss, and that just wasn't the case. There were a few players that apparently sandbagged it, had different lineup compositions, and pulled it out in the top 32 alongside Bandletree and Lee Sin or Nami to try and counteract that Scion. It worked out pretty well for them, but I did not expect this massive upheaval within the top 5 where like Scion stays up here, Lee Sin stays up here, and then like Ziggs, Nami, and Bandle Pirates all fall to the wayside. Like I did not expect this big of a change in the top 5, and I kind of want to go back and look at the other seasonals and see if this is a trend where players have swapped over en masse, and that's just something that I've been overlooking. But I felt like for the most part we haven't seen a big swap like this in quite some time, especially to the degree where only 3 of the top 5 decks from Swiss are remaining. But part of that was how consistent some of our comfort decks were in the past, whereas now a lot of them have gotten thrown out the window. Like Draven, Scion, and Lee Sin were probably in the top 5 of most, if not all, seasonals, and that would remain for top 32, whereas now kind of don't have access to things like that. But this definitely took me by surprise. A lot of the top 32 took me by surprise. The Skathis pile, or Desinata control, whatever you want to call it, it's not Leeson, sorry, it's Vi and Elise, and it's not something that I talked about in Tournament Tactician. I was aware of it, but I didn't really think players are going to move over to it. Traditionally, Shadow Isle Deliverance on control has looked good in the beginning, especially, I think all of them have been Elise Vi, right? From Karina to control, to Ladros Timelines, now Desinata, or the Skathis pile, whatever you want to call it. Ladros controlled, I think, is what Giant Slayer called it, but doesn't really matter. They look pretty good in like the first week or so, and then they kind of fall off a cliff, and the inconsistencies pop up. And I didn't like notice anything that stood out to me about the Skathis pile, like different from other Piltover and Shadow Isle control decks that we had seen in the past. I wasn't really sure that anyone was going to swap over to it. It did have a small presence, but ultimately I don't think it made it too far in the tournament. But yeah, I mean, part of it comes down to like being unable to predict players going for weird things that they didn't run in Swiss, like Lurk coming out as a counter to the Nami decks in top 32. It didn't really work out. I don't think any of the Lurk players made it super far. But the fall off of Ziggs Poppy and Vandal Pirates is something that I didn't expect. And what's really funny to me about this is that we switch up our charts a lot. We move over to this massive Sivir Akshan meta, which is sort of the opposite of what happened in the World Championship, where Sivir Akshan was a very popular deck, and then, going into the actual event, it fell off a cliff and then fell off even harder for the top 8. What's funny to me is that, we all came in, yeah, we're going to beat the Scion decks, we're going to beat the Nami decks or the Lee Sin decks, we're going to like soft counter all of these. And then Ochidi just runs back their Swiss lineup of Scion, Nami, and Ziggs Poppy and just wins the tournament. Just said, hey, I'm going to bring the 3 power picks. You guys can all overthink yourselves into oblivion trying to counter this, but I'm just going to come in with the exact same decks I ran in Swiss, the 3 most powerful decks in the meta, and I'm just going to get there. And that's exactly what happened. I did an analysis on the last few turns of the Ochidi and Kochua game with Kochua. I went over sort of the last 2 turns of the Nami versus Sivir Akshan match because I think that it really could have gone either way. And Ochidi got a pretty good string of draws in like the final hour in order to win things, but I definitely think that like Kochua very well could have won the tournament, but he didn't, and Ochidi did, and that makes it really funny that everybody swaps over to, yeah, we're gonna counter the Nami. Nami, falls off a little bit from the play rate, and then just manages to clutch it out still. So there's a lot to take in here, but I think the major takeaways in terms of like why I got things as wrong as I did was I didn't expect the Yordles and Arms elusive rally upticks, partially because it's a very messy archetype, both in terms of champion composition and region composition, and it's something that's so soupy and hard to keep track of that it's very difficult to predict like what lineups players going to be bringing it in, because there's a lot of different considerations you can make. For example, like Kochua, who got second place in the tournament, ran Lulu Zed and Teemo Poppy as Bandle City Demacia and Ionia Demacia. So like that's something that's really difficult to try and predict from an analytical standpoint. Like look at what we got out of the Swiss rounds, and even if you say, hey, yeah, maybe players are going to come in and counteract these Nami and these Lee Sin strategies with a lot of rally, it's going to be very difficult to figure out exactly what kind of rally decks they're going to be bringing. And it really highlights something, for me at least, that players have been complaining about, which is the Riot Lock format. Now, at around the World Championship, we were complaining about this because of like triple Bandle Tree lineups, where you're basically just playing against the same deck 3 times. And I think the triple Rally lineups also insinuate that a little bit, where, like Sivir Akshan is a very solid deck, Yordles and Arms, Elusive Rally, like these are all very good decks. And the only thing that you really feel like you're giving up in any of this is the Lulu in your Yordles and Arms deck. Maybe you'd like to play Poppy Zed and Lulu Poppy here, or Lulu Zed and Lulu Poppy. Like you're giving up like one champion, and it really isn't impacting the overall power level of your deck too much. In fact, funnily enough, we even saw the Teemo come in very clutch for Kochua as he got a Shroom victory against Sixten in the top 4. So even making that lineup consideration didn't hurt him, and the Teemo itself came in clutch, which probably should have been a Lulu if there was allowed to be an amount of overlap. But like it's something, the Riot Lock is like, players making big adaptations to the Riot Lock and just running the same deck multiple times is something that's always hard to predict. But I still feel like this kind of came out of nowhere. And obviously it didn't, right? Because there was such a big uptick in it. It's not like Kochua was the only one to swap over to Sivir Akshan in this triple rally lineup. A couple of other players did as well. So like there was something that I missed here, some kind of disconnect from the Swiss to the top 32. And I don't know if it was just a lot of people getting on the same page or what, but it's something that I really need to dive into and figure out, because I completely whiffed on how many players were going to swap over to these soft counter lineups and how much the top decks were going to fall off. I feel like this might be an outlier, but it's definitely something I'm going to like take to heart and sort of think about going into the next seasonal as like a potential for this massive swap to happen, especially if we are seeing the matchup charts that we kind of saw this time around. But Yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to go over. I'm kind of sick today, so this is coming out super late. I didn't want to like go super into it. But one thing I also did want to mention is like you look at this chart here. It's not as relevant, but when we look at like regional composition, there were big swings. Like Noxus fell off pretty hard, Bilgewater fell off pretty hard. This was all like the Namis and the Bandle Pirates going away, and then like Shadow Isle near doubles, Shurima near doubles because everybody swaps over to Sivir Akshan, and Freljord goes down. Like we lose the Plunder, we lose the Thralls to go over to that. But it was something that I found kind of funny. But I think that like this is a chart that I could also learn something from, and just looking at like, hey, just because these things aren't performing well in Swiss, players might make a big adaptation. And I think I just need to be thinking more about lineups rather than singular decks in the future, and seeing the synergies kind of come together. But yeah, I think, yeah, like I said, I did very well in Swiss. I did not do very well in top 32. Like analyzing on Swiss, I give myself an A. Analyzing on top 32, I'd give myself like a C plus at best. Like it was not very good. But yeah, I'm going to work better in the future and try to give you guys as much accurate information as I can, and, really try to make my word something that you can take to heart, and feel like it's something that you can trust, and perform well in the seasonal based off of the information that I provide. So thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and I will be back tomorrow for a patch review of our first balance patch in quite some time.